beginning.
Hey everyone, you're currently being recorded. So good morning. Thank you for joining us. For those who don't know me, my name is David Soleil. I'm a student data privacy auditor. You might notice I am not Whitney. Whitney is currently not in the country, but was planning on joining us remotely. We learned that our IT security is working very effectively at geo-locking our access to USB accounts because they, I think, assume that we generally wouldn't be logging in from out of the United States, which is a really fun thing to learn 15 minutes before you're starting an event that Whitney has the Zoom credentials for. So thank you for accommodating us with that. It looks like we're mostly here. And I imagine other people will be coming in as we go. The other thing, and I did get permission from Whitney to say this, as I know she very much wanted to be here with you all because this is looking like it would be her last time participating in this event since she has taken another position at the state auditor's office involving privacy. So this is, she should be transitioning sometime in the next month to that new position. So you heard it here first. Other than that, let me talk about the program we have for you. We're going to try our best, I think, to get back on time, knowing that we had to start 15 minutes late due to the technical difficulties. But we do have two individuals from the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC, at the US Department of Education. They're going to be doing the two opening presentations. So one is on the topic of data breach response, and then they will have a presentation regarding sharing data with researchers. At that point, we'll move from the US Department of Education people. We'll have a brief break as we get set up for the state privacy team. We'll be having two presentations at that point. One is going to be very interactive. We're going to put you into breakout groups. This is something we did last spring for those who remember. So we'll give you a scenario and we'll play with it. We'll ask questions about it and we'll see what we can come up with. And then we'll close with a panel discussion that is going to involve 4 individuals from different LEAs around the state. We're going to be talking about their implementation of the Student Data Privacy Consortium, or SDPC, or also their use of the Learn platform tool. And so I think that'll be a really good conversation, especially if you're not familiar with these tools and how they can assist in privacy, among other things. You'll hopefully be able to learn a lot from those. Let's see. I believe the default is you're all muted, and we're gonna try to keep it that way until we get into that breakout room portion. If you do have questions, then please enter them into the chat. We'll be monitoring it throughout, and we will get to them as makes sense within the space of the presentation, or toward the end. Although also it is making me think, because I believe the data breach response does tend to be a little more interactive, want to get you talking. So we might have to look and see how we handle unmuting people during that. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first presentation, the data breach response.
And thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. Looking forward to a great session. As David mentioned, this is the data breach response session. So we're going to be focused on a little more interactivity. So feel free to engage with each other and with me through the chat features. If there's more lengthy discussion to have, we can talk about the unmuting and having a discussion if we get to that. On the other side of this, we'll be having my colleague, Ross Lemke, who's the director of PTAC, who will be giving us that data sharing with researchers session following. So with that said, let's get into the data brief session. A quick kind of review of how this session is going to go. I'm going to start talking about data breaches in education, try to give you an idea of where we as a ecosystem are with regard to these security incidents and critical data breach. We're going to walk through an exercise. So I'm going to present you with a scenario that may or may not be a data breach. It will start out with some background information. And then together, we're going to walk through this scenario. And over time, the scenario will unfold and we'll add to it, just as in the case of a data breach. And then at the end, we're going to kind of circle back and talk about our journey, talk about some of the best practices that we and this fictional organization that we will be a part of in this exercise could have done to make things better or avoid situation. And with that, let's talk a little bit about where we are. So education in recent years has become the target of very sophisticated cyber criminal groups, ransomware groups, other types of cyber attackers have recognized that schools are big, juicy repositories of sensitive information, private information, not only about our students, but also about our employees. So we've seen some renewed focus there. We've seen a lot of targeting of K-12 organizations. And that's resulted in hundreds of breaches over the last 3 years. Actually, that's kind of understating it. I think we had something of in the order of 200 to 300 breaches that we're aware of just last year alone. So there are a ton of schools and state agencies and post-secondary institutions being hit every day. And the result of that is millions and millions and millions of employee and staff records, student records that are being accessed, ransomed, or otherwise made ill with on a weekly basis. We see 4 to 5 of them come across my desk every week. So there's this sort of focus on some particular areas, especially as we come into tax season. We're going to see more of these sort of tax-focused attacks, W-2 scams, and that sort of thing that will be popping up and persistent throughout the tax season. Ongoing threats like ransomware are a big issue. Ransomware is right now the biggest threat to education data systems. And of course, with the change in our delivery of education services, with the health emergency, the COVID pandemic, et cetera, we're leaning a lot on remote learning and these new technology platforms to get things done. Case in point, today we're doing this remotely where normally it would be in person. So education is not immune to very sophisticated cyber attacks. There are hackers and groups out there that are specifically looking for schools. We're no longer the stumble upon target of these organizations. In fact, a great place to follow would be the CISA the FBI. They have issued several warnings in the last year for K-12 organizations to be on the lookout for things like ransomware groups that are specifically targeting, and they provide lots of great information. So in addition to following us here at PTAC, also consider some of these national level law enforcement groups that are providing these sorts of heads up. So what does that look like in terms of the schools that are being victimized by data breach events? Here's a great example. This usually opens people's eyes, right? You can hardly see the map under all the dots. As you zoom in, those dots get smaller and split up into more dots. And so eventually, you get to kind of see a noise level of dots across the country. And these are all schools that have been the victim of some kind of data breach event, whether it's lost devices or ransomware attacks or sophisticated cyber intrusions or student or insider threat. All of these schools have had some form of data breach in recent years. But I think the story is best told if we look at it over time by year. And you can see in the 5-6 years ago, there were relatively few. There was a sort of small noise level focus on schools, and then as the pandemic hit, you can see this exponential growth in numbers of not only in breach events but in records and the amounts of data which are being accessed in these events. So I think it's clear to see that we can no longer rely on the likelihood of the enemies not showing up. They are going to show up. We need to make sure that we're ready to receive them. Sun Tzu was a smart guy, and what he thought of those many years ago is still applicable today. So hopefully throughout the process of this scenario, we can kind of prepare ourselves, learn what works and what doesn't, and sort of familiarize ourselves with the process of responding in the case of one of these incidents. So let's start with some background information. Right? We'll take a kind of a time traveling trip back, and if you will, imagine yourselves on a Monday afternoon in mid-2020. We're in the midst of the COVID health emergency. The schools are mostly shut down. We're doing in-person. We're not doing in-person classes, but we are doing remote learning, and all of our teachers and staff are having to work remotely. So we're relying heavily in this organization, this sort of fictional school that we all work in. We're relying heavily on these remote solutions. We're telecommuting. We're leveraging all of our partner systems and our video conferencing tools, et cetera, to get our daily work done. So in the morning here on this Monday, as Mondays often do, the IT manager receives a phone call from a teacher who came into the office to pick up some lesson plans from her desk at school. She claims that her computer's background has been changed and there's now a message being displayed on the screen. All the IT people just kind of groaned. And this is what the message looks like. Obviously, this is a ransom note. Hi, company, your device has been encrypted. Don't try to use your backups, etc. Get in touch with us. We'll provide some proof. All of those things that are typical to a ransomware ransom note. Key fact here, PISA is actually a real ransomware group, and they are currently ravaging the K-12 space. So in this particular case, this is pretty relevant. Touchpads. So a little more background. Your IT staff obviously gets very excited about this. This is potentially a not great thing. So they're auditing school systems and they find that 23 computers within the school are now exhibiting this notification screen for the PISA ransomware. So 23 systems. The teacher shows up to pick things from the desk and in the course of that discover that 23 systems in the school are affected by this. So let's talk a little bit about what we know, right? So obviously we're looking at the potential here to be a ransomware attack. We know at least 23 computers are involved currently at school, and some of these systems have not been accessed in some time. Obviously, we've been working remotely, so many of these systems may have been affected by this ransomware for some time. So with that said, let me present you with a couple of ways forward, and we can talk about which way we think is the best way forward given what we know currently. If you would, put your answers in the chat. If you think you know which one is the best way forward, please do that. A is to immediately wipe all these affected machines and reinstall all the software on them. That's kind of the natural reaction, right? If something goes wrong with your computer, just wipe it and reinstall it. B, immediately shut down the school connections to the internet and report that issue to the FBI. So slam the door shut and let's call Johnny Law and let him know what happens. Or C, do we initiate our incident response process, start validating these facts, and move to isolate and contain the threat? And I see that folks are already starting to put stuff in the chat, and we got some folks here. It looks like the general consensus is C. Does anyone think it's not C? No one taking a chance on A or B. Well, that's good, because in this particular case, C is probably the best answer. There's a couple of reasons for that. Wiping the machines obviously would solve the problem for that individual machine, but it would also ensure that we could never get the data that was on that machine back unless we had good backup data. And there may be backup data for these machines, but it's a little premature at this point to eliminate the possibility of retrieving some of this data. Obviously, B has some merits to it. There may be a point at which we bring law enforcement in. There may be, obviously shutting down the connection to the outside world, eliminating the possibility of these adversary who may be operating in our schools' networks and systems, cutting off that connection to the outside world. That might be a beneficial thing. But that's all assuming a lot about our situation, right? The very first thing that we need to do is we need to break glass on that incident response process, open it up, and start following the manual, right? We have to play like we trained and start validating those facts. We need to make sure that this is what we think it is, and this isn't a haha funny joke by one of the students changing the backgrounds on computers or some other type of event that may not have the same impact, right? We need to validate that this event has occurred in the way that we think it has. And then if we find that there is, a potential here for a real issue, then we need to move to isolate and contain that threat. And some of those steps might include shutting down that communication to the outside world. Someone just said, what incident response plan? Well, I hope that you have one. And in the process of this today, hope that we show you the value of doing that. So certainly, the first step is to validate that something has occurred, and then once we've determined that, then we start taking steps to correct. The other two answers are just a little bit premature. So let's talk a little bit about where we are, right? We think we're involved in updating a resume. That probably comes a little later. What do we think some of the root causes of these types of events are? We're talking about, obviously, a ransomware event in a school. What do you think are the main causes? Anyone want to take a swing at some root causes for ransomware in schools? What about clicking on things, right? Lack of training. There we go. That's a perfect one. So most of these events have some form of social engineering component to them, right? So training our users, training our staff, training leadership to recognize things like phishing emails or other types of social engineering attacks. It's good to know. Amy had mentioned that we take privacy very seriously, and I'm glad to hear that. That makes my heart smile. I also take privacy and security very seriously, so I'm glad that you do that. Keeping the use of those systems to to the acceptable uses. So having an acceptable use policy within the school that dictates what is and is not acceptable uses for schools' IT systems. Yeah, that's a great one. Things like weak passwords, right? Access control. We're in an era of remote access. So if you have a weak password and remote access exists, everyone in the neighborhood may be able to get access. You would be surprised how many people I know that still have password 1 as their VPN login. So lots of potential issues here that could be the genesis of this. So how do we control these types of events and reduce damage? Well, we talked a little bit about some of the things that we can do, right? From a technological perspective, we can slam the door after it, but that's a little like slamming the barn door shut after the horses run out, right? What can we do in advance of an event happening to make it more difficult? Things like multi-factor authentication, for example. But once the event has occurred and we're trying to get control of this, get our arms around it, Things like turning off access to the outside world, things like removing those machines might be helpful. And at this point, do we need to tell anybody, right? We've just now sort of in the genesis portion of the event, who do we need to tell as a school to get all the resources marshaled? Is there a central organization that we need to tell? Do we need to report this to law enforcement? So with those things kind of bubbling in our heads, let's muddy the waters a little bit and give you a little more information. So obviously we're going to start doing our validation steps. Go do an investigation, find out where we are. We quickly determine that these computers are in fact infected with PISA ransomware. They are encrypted. And we've seen significant data transfers, which appear to be data exfiltration. So in addition to removing our ability to get the data, it appears that the bad guys actually transmitted the data back to themselves, copied it. So they stole the data as well. Most of these connections appear to come from a machine in the science department, which has not been encrypted. So the machine is sort of communicating with the bad guys, but it's not affected by the malicious software. This machine belongs to a science teacher who runs the school's robotics club. This computer also has remote desktop enabled. This allows that teacher and the students to log in remotely and interact with several small robots that they have in the classroom as part of the club's extracurricular activities. So, it's an after-school thing. They have some robots in the classroom, and the kids log in remotely and control the robots and write programs, and the teacher interacts with them remotely as well. So we have sort of a connection to the outside world here. So let's talk about a couple of possible scenarios, and we'll get your feedback on which one you think is the most probable. So the first one, A, is that the teacher's home computer was compromised and that attackers were able to obtain his school login and password and just simply log into this school computer. We have B, which is the teacher did not use a complex password and attackers were able to simply guess the password by trying complex passwords, or common passwords rather. And C, the final option, attackers exploited a zero-day vulnerability in the remote desktop protocol to gain access to the machine. Which do you think is the most likely in this particular scenario? We have some folks saying A. Any other takers on A? Oh, a few. Does anyone think it isn't A? Do we have any takers for B or C? A few B's popping up. No one for C. Anyone here think it was a 0-day? Couple going with C. Okay, so we have representation for all the answers. So let's well, if you have no idea, you will shortly. Translating C. So let's talk about C first, because we got some folks on the A and the B and the C train here. Let's talk about what they are. So a zero-day attack is a vulnerability in a piece of software that there's no patch for. So if I'm sitting at home and I discover a vulnerability in a piece of software that folks are using that allows me to gain access to the machine, and there's no patch available for that flaw in the software, that's considered to be a zero-day exploit. And in this case, we're talking about a hacker leveraging one of those exploits against the remote desktop protocol, which would then, of course, allow them access to the system. So with that in mind, certainly that's a possibility. We can't remove that as a possibility. However, 0 days are highly coveted, very valuable things. They're worth a lot of money in the hacker underground. If you discover a 0-day vulnerability, you're going to make a lot of money selling that. So it's very unlikely that someone is going to truly leverage a 0-day attack against, especially something as prevalent as remote desktop protocol. It's certainly a possibility, but it's highly unlikely that a zero-day exploit will be used against a school. It's much more likely the other two answers, and let's talk a little bit about the other two. We have some takers for A, and that's again a much more likely scenario where the teacher's home computer was compromised, and they were able to then forward an attack based on the credentials they stole there against the school. And again, that's possible. But it does require a certain sophistication. They have to know that that teacher is employed at the school. They have to rationalize all of those connections, and then forward an attack against the school. And all of that is doable, certainly possible. But we're talking about the most possible thing here. And of course, if we were to just run the numbers, simply not using a complex password or a too simple password, something, maybe it's not password one, but maybe it's their, the date they graduated or their birthday or some other publicly available piece of information. That's a much more likely scenario, or simple brute force of a common password. That is the most likely scenario. So I think B is probably our most likely situation. The teacher just simply not using a strong enough password, and the attackers were able to simply log into the system as the teacher. So let's talk a little bit more about the scenario. We'll move the ball down the court a little bit here. So the attackers have gotten in touch with you. They claim to have all the copies of the encrypted data that they have removed your ability to access, and they're demanding that you pay them $50,000 equivalent in Bitcoin, a type of cryptocurrency, in exchange for the decryption keys and their solemn promise not to divulge the data. Your logs confirm that attackers have been able to exfiltrate large amounts of sensitive data from various staff computers and several network shares that contain student data. So they've got some important data, right? Things that are personal in nature, sensitive in nature, and they're demanding a payment for not only for you to gain access to that data, but to avoid a public disclosure of that data, which is an unfortunate reality to too many schools today. So what do we know? We know they've gained a foothold in our system through a system that had remote desktop protocol enabled, and then clearly they were able to harvest some credentials, either that of the teacher or for other credentials that happen to be on the machine, giving them further access to the school's network. They were able to exfiltrate large amounts of sensitive data, and they're demanding $50,000 in Bitcoin in exchange for those decryption keys. So again, we're faced with a quandary. What do we do at this point? And so let me give you a couple more options, and we can talk about the pros and cons of each. So A, we could force a password reset immediately across the domain, including all of our service accounts and those accounts in the background that run all of those critical enterprise services. And then we can reinstall those affected the machines right away and get them back into service. We could we could separate the affected machines from the network and contain that infection. We could slam that door outbound to make sure we cut off any connections to the potentially bad guy control machines on the outside. And we can start that process of validating our backups to see if we can get that data back. Do we have to pay these folks, or can we just simply retrieve our data? Or do we cancel classes and notify the public of this breach that's occurred, report that incident to the police, and hire a third-party response firm? So 3 pretty serious options here, right? These decisions are coming with some weight. And we have some folks saying B is the good option. Streaming in some Bs here. Does anybody think A or C are the better choices? Pretty much consensus on B, I'm seeing. The kids need a break. So one C because the kids need a break, but a vast sort of consensus on B. I haven't seen any A's. So let's talk about them. So in A, some of those things sound great, right? Password resets, And certainly if we think that there are compromised credentials, that may come down the pike at some point or another. But again, we're talking about reinstalling machines. Well, we haven't made that decision yet, right? If we reinstall, we lose that data. So there are elements of A that are good, but the timing may not be right at this point, right? And the same with C. We're talking about canceling classes and notifying the public, reporting the incidents, et cetera, hiring a third-party response firm. Some of those things may be appropriate at some point, but perhaps not at this point. It might be great if you don't have the staff in-house. Having a third-party response firm may speed your recovery efforts. Certainly, if you suspect that a crime has been committed, you might think about informing law enforcement. But do we really think at this point that we know enough to be able to articulate with enough granularity to the public about this event? Well, I don't know. Those are questions that would be obviously affected by things like state law around data breach notifications, and also common sense, right? It's great to be transparent about the issue, but we want to make sure that we're telling them facts, that we have validated these things, and that we have some kind of indication of what is occurring. And we may not be there yet. So yes, I agree with the vast majority of you here. B is probably the best answer. You want to separate those affected machines from the network. You want to make sure that they don't cause additional havoc within the environment. Contain that infection, may cut off the bad guy's ability to communicate, and then start that process of validating the backups, right? Because we're talking about data that we have to get back in place in order to get our operations going again. So B is the right choice there, I believe. So is this bigger than the affected machines, and in what ways? Now, obviously, we've got some concern about credentials being compromised, and these credentials are applicable across machines, right? They're at an enterprise level in many cases. So we're talking about the potential of accessing many more pieces of information from non-affected machines using legitimate credentials, right? So that's a concern for sure. The $50,000 question is, do we consider paying the ransom? And that's a good one. Do we consider paying the ransom? What do you think? Oh, immediately with the nose. Lots of no's. So a lot of consensus around no. Does anyone have any answer? We have one that says yes. Someone, Tanya just threw USB under the bus. So I think the consensus here is that no, and that's a tricky question. This is always a tricky question, and none of us want to pay the ransom, right? No one wants to be rewarding the bad guys for their evil deeds. But I would recommend that certainly if you can avoid doing it, do it. But I'm a big proponent of keeping as many options available as you can, as long as you can. Right? That's not to say that you will ever come to a situation where you have to pay, and certainly if you ask the FBI or a law enforcement agency, they'll tell you no, never do that. But the key thing here to remember is that the FBI is not trying to run a school, and if it's not their student information system that is down, or et cetera. So if there's a rationale that allows you to get access to your data, then you may consider it. At least keep it on the table for as long as you can, and see if other options work out first. Now we do have a great comment. Amy commented that she could never trust the promise that came with that payment, and certainly, any payment of a ransom is not done with the idea that you're going to keep the data from being a breach, right? Obviously these are criminal elements, and you can't trust them to not reuse that data or expose that data. But if you have critical data which is unavailable to you, and that data means your organization runs or doesn't run, then the cost can sometimes be justified, and certainly there's a risk. Not all these criminal elements will come through on their end of the bargain. Sometimes, there have been situations where people have paid ransom, and in the meantime, a law enforcement agency has taken down the group, and so no decryption keys were forthcoming. But there have been other situations where a ransom has been negotiated and decryption keys enabled access to critical information. So I'm not a proponent of paying ransoms. If you can avoid it, certainly do that. But I will tell you that having options is probably the best way forward. As a best practice, try to keep all your options for as long as you can. So I think, so we had a couple of great comments here around some of the legalities and considerations around these sorts of situations. So things to keep in mind, certainly. I think some of the other questions, I want to keep everyone's time here in mind. Certainly, this is something, when you start demanding payments and that sort of thing, this is something that you might want to consider reaching out to law enforcement, reaching out to other state resources, making sure that folks are in fact weighing in on the subject. And you want to ask yourself the question, does this threat impact our ability to conduct learning, right? These are all things that kind of go into this calculus on how we're going to react. So I know I've tortured you with twists and turns in this, and so let's do it just a little bit more. So we've been able to identify that the attackers were present in the environment for at least 2 weeks prior to the discovery of this encrypted desktop. So they've had a lot of time. And they found domain accounts, administrative accounts that have been created by the attackers. So clearly they have had super user privileges in your enterprise environment. And that is obviously a big problem. That means the compromise is pretty fundamental. So the good news is that you have validated that you have good backups from a time period prior to the infection. So there's a possibility of rolling back these changes, rolling back to a time prior to the bad guy elements showing up. The bad news, obviously, is that your Active Directory is potentially compromised, right? You've kind of lost the battle at this point, and you're faced with reconstituting things from backups in some cases. So a little mixture of good and bad. You have backups, but the issue is much more complicated. The recovery from this issue will take several days to accomplish. You will have to turn off some of these critical systems like your remote access capabilities, your distance learning platform. And so obviously this will affect the school's ability to conduct classes. So you're going to have to notify the public. So quick kind of circling back here, the attackers were able to access your Active Directory, so get into the fundamental operations of your enterprise, compromising critical accounts, creating accounts of their own. Recovery of those is going to require you to turn off these key systems. So you may be down for a day or two or whatever the case may be. So obviously notifications have to be made. So what is the best approach, given our three options here, for notifying parents and the public? So we have the principal just send out a notice to parents informing them of the school closure due to the data breach, and referring questions to our incident manager that hopefully have appointed there at the beginning of the incident for clarification. Do we hand it over to district public affairs communications teams to develop and disseminate clear and concise messaging, talking about the closure and directing parents to the website for more information, and then putting up those that sort of detailed information on the website? Or do we have the incident manager call the local paper and TV station and ask them to run a spot to let the public know that their school is canceled and not provide much else? So we already have folks chiming in. We've got a lot of B's. We've got some A, B's. Okay. Does anyone think C is the right answer? Have the incident manager call the TV station and say, run with this, guys? No, lots of B's. Okay, well, let's talk about A and B, right? C, obviously, is probably not the right way forward. That's sort of that's an invitation for chaos. You know, A has some good points. The principal sending out notices to parents, that might be great if you're aware of what information was available. Sending that blast out to parents might calm some nerves and provide some access to resources. But I think probably at this point, B is the best way forward. As a best practice, having folks that are professionals at public affairs and communications handle the messaging and interact with the public is probably the best way to go, because you have a single point of contact. The communications are going to be consistent and transparent and concise. And those are the important things when you're trying to manage expectations on the public side of things. So definitely, I would say that B is probably the best answer. But elements of A would make sense depending on the situation, especially if you know the cohort of people who've been affected by the breach. Having the principal reach out, through some kind of a notice might be a good idea. Well, we had one comment about concerns publishing the details on the website. Obviously, you're not going to want to post a lot of details about technical or sensitive information on the website, but providing some basic general information, providing some contact information so that folks that have been affected can get a hold of someone that can talk to them about specifics might be a good way to kind of address that. Certainly, you would not want to necessarily divulge any information which could be useful to an adversary or harmful to someone else's privacy. So is this a data breach? Do we think this is a data breach? You can always call PTAC. Someone had asked if you're a tiny school or don't have a PR person, call us. Well, you certainly call us. We can't act on your behalf, but we can certainly connect you with resources. So what do we think? Does anyone want to go on the record and saying that this is a data breach? Does anyone think it's not a data breach? Everyone's running away from their keyboards right now. Well, data breach is a very loaded word. Yes, it is a data breach. All right, Mark, thank you. Somebody is standing up. So this is a data breach. Well, when we start using the words data breach, there are some important things to keep in mind. If we're talking about it from a FERPA perspective, there's no such thing as a data breach. You either disclosed or did not disclose the information, and that was either proper or improper. But if you do a search for data breach in the FERPA language, you're probably not going to find anything. So most likely, the thing that is going to determine whether this is considered to be a, quote, data breach from a legal sense are going to be things like your state laws, which is why it's so important to have legal counsel present or legal input to your breach response process. So if you have an incident that's ongoing, the sooner you can get some legal counsel involved in the process, the better off you're going to be, and the more likely you'll be to check those boxes, those legal boxes that need to be checked. So things that we can do immediately. I know we're right at time here, so we'll kind of hurry things up at the end. Some things that we can do immediately. Training. We talked about some of them in the beginning. Training the staff. Be aware. Make strong passwords. Implementing tools to help people be hard targets, like multi-factor authentication. That's a huge thing, right? If you have a password that's easily guessed, but it also requires a smart card or a fob or some other type of second factor, well, that bad guy may not have access to that. You may have foiled this before it began. So there are lots of things we can do, technical and policy-wise, to protect ourselves and reduce the risk. So big questions. Do you have an incident response team? Does it work in a ransomware scenario? Hopefully the answer to that is yes. And if you don't, please, think about creating one. It's certainly a best practice. We've got some great resources here in a second that I'll point you to if you're involved in that. And if you do have a plan, make sure that you test it. Do what we're doing now. Come up with a scenario and test that plan around a table just like this, literally a tabletop, and walk through it. We have some resources for that as well. And of course, we talked a little bit about some of the ways a school or district can communicate about an incident most effectively. The best way to do that is to have someone whose job it is to do public communications be the person delivering these messages, crafting and delivering them. And when you have multiple sources of external information, things get muddled, things tend to be confused and speculative, and you run into problems. So to the extent that you can, make those consistent and transparent, and you should have much fewer issues around that. I think we've talked about most of those. A lot of folks ask, well, what is the real issue here? I mean, there's no way in the world that a school would be vulnerable to this sort of thing. And so I posted this because I think it's key. This is just schools that I found a couple minutes before this chat that have screenshots of remote desktop protocol active. So from an education perspective, we are all over the map with this. And if just one of these folks has an easily guessed password, then this scenario is very likely to occur in that situation. So yes, while we did torture that and make it as bad as possible, the foundation of this is something that is eminently plausible in schools across the country. So let's keep that in mind. Make sure you have backups. Make sure you have an incident response plan. You want to have that accountability reach back to leadership. You want to have awareness in terms of training your staff and especially leadership about the threat and what to do. And of course, patching and updates, I think that goes without saying. Make sure you have those security patches in place. Definitely consider calling us for help. PTAC is a technical assistance organization. We're not the FERPA police. We are here to help you if you have an incident or you suspect that your organization is involved in an incident. Give us a call. We can help. I've been doing this for 27 years now, so I can provide you with some best practices. We can hook you up with resources or refer you to folks who might be able to help. We also have some great resources here, like our data breach response checklist. We have some downloadable data breach training kits that have scenarios, just like we just did, but with facilitation guides, and it's all rebrandable for your school or organization. Check those out. And we have great online training videos. We've got FERPA online training, which probably many of you have seen. And so PTAC is a great resource, and you can get to it at our website at studentprivacy.ed.gov. And with that, I know we're just a little over time. Let me pass that back over to Ross for the next session. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to share my screen. Somebody scream at me if you can't see it. I hear no screaming. Well, actually, there was screaming, but I think that was just as a result of Mike's presentation. So let's just power right through here. We're going to go back one slide. Sure, absolutely. All of this is available on our website, studentprivacy.ed.gov. And we'll make this deck available, and I'm sure that we can get you the links as well. But we are short on time, so we're going to go ahead and keep moving. My apologies if Mike frightened you, but that's a good thing. It's good to be scared on this, especially if you are one of those smaller school districts. But the most important thing, absolutely, is having a plan in place. Now, I'm going to talk to you about sharing data with researchers. So this is not going to be nearly as terrifying, but is just as important. So in general, because it's sort of as an overview, I'd say education data, when used appropriately, can provide, all sorts of fantastic insights about how your students are achieving. When typically a lot of times when you're doing an analysis on data, you're not doing it necessarily in-house, but you're sharing it with third parties. So there's federal law in place that covers all this, and this law requires that schools and educational agencies ensure that the data is protected and not redisclosed without permission. So the office that we represent is the Student Privacy and Policy Office, SPPO. They administer two federal privacy laws. There's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which I would argue everybody on this call has at least heard of before. And then the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, PPRA, which I would argue that probably 5 of you have heard of before, at least that if you're anything like our typical audiences. So these laws like FERPA and PPRA represent the floor for protecting student privacy. There can be other laws in place that offer additional protections, such as the laws that are in place in Utah, provided that they are not less restrictive than FERPA. Then you can have a law in place that is going to be more restrictive, provide additional requirements around protecting student privacy. But also, as you're sharing data, they've heard of PPRA. Fantastic. Consider yourselves lucky. And actually, I will say that those of you in Utah, you are tremendously lucky to have David, Whitney, and team in place to provide this forum for you and to provide the resources, the updates, and the training. There are other states and other districts that are not nearly as lucky. So in most audiences, I gave several presentations when I was on site a week and a half ago. Each audience that I brought up PPRA, and out of an audience of 40, 50, 60, one person would raise their hand. And that is typically the case. But we're going to go over PPRA and what it is. So there are other laws that might come into play depending on the type of data you're trying to share, such as Higher Education Act, Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and potentially Head Start regulations. So let's go to the very beginning and let's talk about that 800-pound gorilla in the room of student privacy, and that's FERPA. So FERPA is a privacy law that affords parents certain rights: the right to have access to their children's education records, seek to have those records amended, and the ability to consent to the disclosure of personally identifiable information from education records, except as provided for by law. FERPA applies to public schools. FERPA is a follow the money statute. So if you're receiving funding from an agency that's funded in part by the U.S. Department of Education, then congratulations, you're subject to FERPA. So that's typically your public school districts, your public schools. There's large pots of money that the Department of Education has, such as IDA, Title I. That money flows down to the state education agency and then in turn flows down to the districts and then down to the schools. If you're a school that is, belongs to one of those districts, you're subject to FERPA. Post-secondary issue, it's pretty easy because if you're an institution that takes federal student aid, you're subject to FERPA. Spoiler alert, the vast majority of post-secondary institutions, we're talking over 99%, will take federal student aid. So they're all subject to FERPA. So FERPA protects something called an education record. And I know we're kind of going over some basic stuff, but this is important when we talk about what we're sharing with researchers. Education records are records that are directly related to a student and maintained by an educational agency or somebody that's acting on their behalf. So one of the kind of misconceptions that exist about FERPA is that FERPA only pertains to academic information. Well, it's Ross's report card. That's obviously protected by FERPA, but it's more than that. It's if the school has a spreadsheet that has, column A has the student's name, column B says Monday, Tuesday, then C to D, E, it has every other day of the week. And each column lists the color of shirt that each student wears every day when they come into school. The fact that that information is directly related to that student and it's being maintained on the, somebody's desktop somewhere, that spreadsheet's going to be part of each student's education record. So FERPA protects personally identifiable information. FERPA defines it as your direct identifiers, your indirect identifiers, and other information that alone or in combination is linked or linkable to a specific student that would allow a reasonable person in the school community to have, that does not have personal knowledge of the relevant circumstances to identify the student with reasonable certainty. So your direct identifiers are things that have a one-to-one relationship with the student. There's only one Ross Lemke with a student ID number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are multiple students that have the same birthday or the same race, ethnicity, or same gender that I do. That other information is kind of one of those fun parts of FERPA because it's sort of like that thought exercise. But say you're releasing aggregate data on student achievement at a very small school in your district. And you report that 100% of your Hispanic male students scored advanced on the state math assessment. I have a child that goes to that school. I volunteer in that school. And in this case, I know that it's only a very small school. And I also know that there's only actually one Hispanic student there and I know that because they live a few doors down from me and my son, friends with my son. As a reasonable person in the school community, I can now look at that and ascertain, well, actually, I know what that student's score is. That would be problematic. So FERPA has a prior written consent requirements in order to disclose information from education records to third parties. Consent under FERPA has to specify the records that may be disclosed, the purpose of the disclosure, and identify the party or class of parties to whom that disclosure may be made. So one of the first questions we ask when we're helping districts and states that are dealing with researchers, because typically a researcher calls, says, I'd like to get the data. Our first question tends to be, well, can they take aggregate data? So properly aggregated data can be shared without consent or a FERPA exception. So if I go and release a data set that shows 500 boys scored advanced on the state math assessment and 500 girls scored advanced on the state math assessment, those are really big numbers. I'm probably not going to be able to make a lot of inferences about small changes to or small populations because, again, 500 and 500, so it's hard to pick anything out. But if I released a data set that showed 499 of my non-pirate students scored advanced on the state math assessment and 1 of my pirate students scored advanced on the state math assessment. Well, now if I am a reasonable person in the school community and I know that there's only one kid walking around with an eye patch and a peg leg, pretty sure going to be able to figure out what score they got. So, but if you can apply disclosure avoidance to that, this is sort of our 400 level FERPA class that we're not having today, but there are statistical methods that you can take involving blurring, perturbation, or suppression that can mask those small cells. And if you do it right, then you can release this without really worrying about FERPA. It's the safest way also to share the data with the researchers. However, researchers tend to want the individual level data. So now I'm going to pause for a moment, and actually we're going to go and start our little icebreaker exercise a little late. Who here, and chime into the chat, who is dealing with researchers at the district level, and what types of information are they asking for? Or what type of researchers are you dealing with? COVID data, well, that's popular. As I wait for more people to chime in, be careful about public information requests for COVID or vaccination related information. I am seeing an increasing number of incidents happen where unredacted data or poorly redacted data is being sent out in response to some of those open records requests. Well, okay, well, you know, we got to mask the PII. We're going to go and black out these Excel cells, and then we're going to print it to PDF and then send it to give it to the person that's made the request. And then the person who made the request can go highlight those blacked out cells and see the text that is underneath. That's a bad thing. Structural research, okay, good. So typically researchers want individual level data. If you're going to go and release individual level data, that release is going to have to happen under one of the FERPA exceptions. As many of you know, as you've gone through privacy training through Utah or sat in on one of my FERPA presentations in the past, there are a variety of exceptions. Not going to go over them all, but directory information, schools in which a student seeks or intends to enroll, health or safety emergency, parents of a dependent student, child welfare agencies, Uninterrupted Scholars Act, or juvenile justice exception. But typically, when we're talking about researchers, we are talking, great, individual data with data sharing agreements are fantastic, and in most exceptions, they are required. But typically when we're looking at researchers, there's 4 potential exceptions that could come into play. There's the audit evaluation exception, the studies exception, the directory information exception, and the school official exception. So you'll notice some asterisks on those exceptions. Those exceptions carry some baggage with them that tend to make them a little inappropriate for sharing data with researchers for reasons I'll get to in a moment. But the thing to understand about FERPA exceptions is that these exceptions are permissive. There's nothing in FERPA that says that your schools or the education agency has to disclose the data. If it meets the requirements of the, of the exception, you are permitted to disclose it, but you can say no. Nothing's forcing you to make that. So as a school or an education agency that is, reviewing these requests, it's up to you. You have to ensure that the data sharing is compliant with FERPA and you are following all the necessary requirements under the exception by which the data is being disclosed. That's your responsibility. The other thing to understand is that not all research requests are necessarily going to fall under one of these exceptions. And if they don't fall under one of these exceptions, then you're going to need to obtain consent. So if you want to know how to trigger me, get my face turned all red, maybe start twitching a little bit, it's say research exception. I hear it all the time. There is no such thing as a research exception under FERPA. Say that again. There's no research exception. I always joke, if a researcher comes to you and says, hey, you could, please give us this data, you can use the research exception, you should just say no. Because if they're using that term, they're misunderstanding something about FERPA. What else are they misunderstanding? That's an avenue of, that's some red flags that I think would be raised. So there's no research exception. There is a studies exception. That sounds like research exception, but the studies exception is fairly narrow. So you can disclose information without consent if it's to other organizations on or behalf of educational agencies to develop, validate, administer predictive tests, administer student aid programs, or improve instruction. That's that last bullet there that tends to be the most important, the most commonly used one. But what you have to understand is that this exception is narrower than some of the other exceptions because it has to meet two overarching criteria. It has to be for the purpose of conducting studies on or behalf of that educational agency or institution. It has to meet one of those three bullets there. If it doesn't cleanly fall under one of those three bullets there, then you're likely not using this exception. Now, if you are using this exception and you're disclosing data to a researcher, you need to have a written agreement between the two or sometimes more parties, saying the study will not permit the identification of any individual parent by anyone other, or individual parent or student by anyone other than the representatives of the organization, and it's going to be destroyed when no longer needed for the study. So this written agreement and all these requirements are sort of built into the statute. But I'm going to bold the important parts. Like I said before, specify the purpose and scope of the study. Specify the information that's going to be disclosed, like data inventory would work really well. And a requirement written into the written agreements that's requiring the researcher to destroy the data when it's done. And then also they can only use it for the purposes for which the data was disclosed. So if you're sharing data with a researcher to do a study on, reading interventions that are happening at that district and whether or not they've improved the reading scores across the school district. If the researcher also wants to go and take that data and he's like, you know what, we want to go take all this reading assessment data and go and look at the math scores because we want to see if like better reading comprehension is going to go and help a student navigate a word problem. Well, that wasn't the purpose of the disclosure. So that would raise some flags for you because that's not what was in the original agreement. So typically, if there's some other use of the data after that, you're probably looking at another written agreement. And I will say it again, the data has to be destroyed when the study is complete. So, that means they can return it back to the school, or they can go and use one of the commonly accepted data destruction methods. But what we see a lot in these written agreements is some kind of affidavit that saying that yes, indeed, we destroyed the data securely, and here's a signature from our representative on that. And then therefore down the road, if it turns out they actually didn't delete the data, that gives you some recourse through your written agreements to handle the situation potentially through the court system. So there's another exception. It's the audit or evaluation exception. So many of you work for schools or districts. You collect a lot of data there, just as part of your regular school operations. A portion of that data gets sent up to the school district, or if you're working at the school district, that data gets sent up to the state. The state uses that data for various purposes. They run studies, do research analyses on it to see how education is doing statewide. They also take that data and report aggregate data sets to the U.S. Department of Education as a result of, or as a condition of the grant programs that Utah is benefiting from. You're receiving all the special education funds, great. Let's send us some aggregate data on how students with disabilities are doing. So what are some examples of penalties to put into agreements? I mean, so if a somebody violates your written agreement, you can always notify the Department of Education, because there are some enforcement actions that could potentially happen against them under FERPA. But the beauty of a written agreement is something that, you know, you can build a lot of whatever you want in there. So as far as some penalties, you can go and you could put a fine, you can make them liable for a data breach, where that data to get out after they said that they disclosed it. You could make them responsible for your response activities. Typically, that's something that you want to go bring your legal counsel into, because you're starting to actually go outside of the FERPA aspects of it, and you're starting to go into the realm of contract law. So back to the audit evaluation exception. So all that data is getting sent up to the state is happening under the audit evaluation exception. If you're sending data using this exception to somebody that's not an education authority, but one of their authorized representative, then you're going to need to have a written agreement. So again, with audit evaluation, the receiving entity has to be a state or local education authority or another FERPA permitted entity, or that authorized representative. So you can, you know, designate just about anybody to be your authorized representative, but when you're designating an authorized representative, you need to enter into another written agreement. So that written agreement has certain requirements, just as the studies exception does. So that third party is responsible for using reasonable methods to ensure to the greatest extent possible that the data is only used for the purposes for which it was disclosed, for that authorized purpose. It's going to protect the information from further unauthorized disclosures. And it's like that with the studies exception, it's going to destroy that data when it's no longer needed or in accordance with the specified time period set in that written agreements. So also under audit evaluation exception, there is a element where data that's received under this exception can be redisclosed on behalf of the agency that sent it. So example of this is the state redisclosing data to researchers under the studies exception, doing something on behalf of the district. We've also seen it used in the case of emergencies as well. You know, there's a major crisis that's hit the state and many districts are out of commission. The state could redisclose information under the health or safety emergency exception on behalf of the district. So authorized representatives of that FERPA permitted entities can only redisclose the PII when expressly authorized in that written agreement. So another thing to understand here is right now we are talking about disclosure of data, sharing data. FERPA covers information that is maintained by a school or an education agency or somebody acting on their behalf. Some research projects might involve the collection of additional data elements. Depending on how that new data is collected and depending on what that data is, PPRA may apply. So, like David mentioned, as agencies in Utah, you receive a lot of training on PPRA. So I'm not going to go super in depth into PPRA, aside from noting that it exists and it's important. It was passed in '74. It was amended a few times, but it was last regulated on kind of a long time ago, 1984. But PPRA affords parents certain rights. Typically, when you think about it, it's rights involving surveys, but it also covers certain types of physical examinations, instructional materials. There's some provisions there on marketing or sale to students. Also has some requirements to districts on having policies around the PPRA and notifications about those policies or notifications of a survey coming down the pike. This PPRA luckily, you get a lot of training on it. Not a lot of other districts do. We are seeing more and more questions come up about PPRA lately. And typically those questions are coming up because people are not necessarily understanding what they can and can't do involving surveys that are being administered to schools. You know, especially in the wake of COVID, you know, student wellness survey, hey, how you doing? A couple of those questions start to go venture into the protected categories under PPRA. PPRA could be implicated if you're not doing your required notices and allowing for opt-outs depending on the funding source of the survey. You could be causing some problems and could put yourself at risk of receiving some complaints under the PPRA. We have some resources. We have a parent's guide to PPRA that we just released. Actually, it was about a year ago. That's on our website, studentprivacy.ed.gov. Hot off the press is a short video that we developed on what is protection of pupil rights amendment. That is on our website as well, but it is also hosted up on the United States Department of Education's YouTube site. All of our resources are free to use, download, copy, share, free to use. So please make use of these. You don't have to come up with everything yourself. We try to provide as much for you on your behalf as we can. So couple, before I finish today, I have a couple tips for you. So if you are an education agency, you need to understand the laws that apply to the data that you're maintaining. FERPA, more than likely, but depending on what other types of data being requested, there could be another law in play. Like if they were asking for free or reduced price lunch data, that the School Lunch Act might also be implicated there. So again, look at the laws that apply to all the data. Also understanding that FERPA is permissive. So if you have a request for data and something doesn't seem right, or you're not comfortable about the data sharing, you don't have to do it. Because ultimately, you're responsible for the data that you're giving to these researchers under the studies of the audit evaluation exception. So if you share data under the studies exception and the researcher in question was a bad actor and they did all sorts of bad things to the data and a lot of it was disclosed inappropriately, guess whose FERPA violation it is? It's yours. That's the first enforcement activity is likely to come against your school district where complaints to be filed. But you don't have to do this alone. PTAC exists for a reason. And one of the things that we do a lot of is we help districts and states navigate research requests. So if you have one that you have questions about, call us. We're happy to help. You know, as David can attest to, oftentimes we'll say it depends, but that's largely because that's true. FERPA is very context specific, and what's permissible in one situation might not be permissible in another situation. We'll also help you review your written agreements. We won't write them for you, but if you have one, we'll be happy to look at it and let you know whether it falls, meets the sort of the mandatory requirements under FERPA, or if it meets the or if it meets the best practice recommendations that the department has made public. If anybody on this call is a researcher, we have some tips for you as well. Only request the data that you really need. Once you receive data appropriately under one of the exceptions, you must protect the data that you hold, because your future research may depend on how good of a steward of the student information that you have. If you go and are a bad steward of that data, that's going to be a FERPA issue, but is that district you receive the data from going to be likely to share data with you again for future research projects? That seems unlikely. But PTAC also exists as a resource that researchers can go to for help as well. So we get questions from them all the time. We are happy to help. We are not the FERPA police. If you're doing something wrong, that's fine. Well, it's not fine. We want to help you fix it, but call us and ask us for help. We will help you fix it. That will be the end of it. I know that we covered a ton of material here and we did get a late start, so I want to go straight to questions. Does anybody have any additional questions? Again, I am sorry for not terrifying you as much as Mike did. I know this is the Halloween season. Maybe next time I'll include some pictures of Freddy or Chucky or something in here to spice the presentation up a little bit. Question about well, I'll start saying this again now that the recording has started. This is our contact information. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have a question about any of the material we covered or any other question related to FERPA. We operate a student privacy help desk. The number is right there. Pick up the phone. You probably will wind up talking to Mike or myself or one of the other experts here at PTAC. We are happy to help you, or you can send us an email. But without further ado, I will pause and I'll hand the reins back to our hosts.
Thank you, Ross. We appreciate your time and your and Mike's flexibility to work with our technical difficulties at the beginning of this. I think that we are going to go on to our next phase, which would be Katie. Katie, would you like to start sharing? We're going to do some of our privacy and plays while we're getting this set up. If anybody wants to run to the restroom real quick or go and get a quick drink, and we'll keep this show going.
Yeah, if you need a bathroom break, run. John's gonna, if you want, obviously I'll be displaying this, but if you want to pull up your own copy of the slideshow, you can use the shortened URL here, or John can also paste it in the chat for us. We'll get going in 1 minute for those who are jogging to the bathroom. As if that's enough time. What am I thinking? Okay, well, we'll get kind of going, just getting started. Some housekeeping stuff. If you're comfortable having your cameras on for this session, or specifically when we get into breakout rooms, that would be awesome. It's always easier to talk to people when you can see who you're talking to. So no pressure, but if you're comfortable with that, that would be great when we get into breakout rooms, or now if you'd like. And then as far as materials go, you're going to need access to one document in particular when we get into the scenarios. And so just kind of keep an eye on the chat there. You can access that with the little chat icon at the bottom, and John will paste that in when we get to that point. And then I just wanted to let you know that I won't be viewing the chat. So if you have questions for me, you can ask them, but John will be checking the chat. So he might do kind of either pause, hey, Katie, here's this question, or he might just kind of hold on to them until the end, but just know that he'll be monitoring that. And then I just want to really quickly introduce myself. Some of you have already been introduced to me, but I know we have quite a few new data managers, and also I'm pretty new to the team. So I'll just quickly give you a rundown of my experience. I was a science teacher at a charter school briefly. It was just half a year in 2011, and then started as a classroom teacher in Twila District in middle school. And I did that for several years. Then I went to the district office there as an ed tech person. So I would do, training and support for teachers as they were learning to use different ed tech products. And then starting in February, I started here as a student data privacy trainer. And I also am have taken on most of the responsibility of the annual privacy review. So for those of you who submitted a bunch of documents and links recently in that stuff that was kind of due October 5th, that's become my responsibility. And so I've kind of been interacting with some of you on that front. And then you'll also get more information from me, feedback on your submission later. Okay, so here's the game plan. I just want to quickly go over our objectives. We're going to talk about educational technology products, or ed tech tools, sometimes like we call them, just very briefly, kind of what that looks like from a privacy perspective. And then a very brief discussion, not even a discussion, a couple slides on how to address sticky privacy issues. Then we'll jump into our scenario. So when we get into our scenario, we'll put you in breakout rooms, and ideally you'll be able to kind of discuss with your group. If when we get to that spot, you're unable to interact with the group, we'll explain to you what you should do. So if I know some of you, you might be working at the front desk, for example, and won't be able to necessarily engage in a conversation, or you might not have a microphone, I'll kind of tell you what to do in that case, but hopefully many of you will be able to participate. And then after that discussion, we'll come back together and kind of talk about it. All right, so our objectives are, one of our primary objectives is we want you to be able to talk with one another. So in your breakout rooms, you'll get a chance to kind of introduce yourself and tell people what your role is and where you work and that kind of thing. And putting these kind of abstract laws into practice. And primarily in this scenario, we're going to be addressing those sticky issues that I loosely referred to. All right, so as promised, let's get into the educational technology products. So here's kind of the very, very, very surface level overview. When you're trying to decide if it's okay for an ed tech product to be used with students, and we're talking specifically about a privacy perspective. So you may have folks in your district or charter that are like, we don't like that because we don't think it's a good tool from a curriculum perspective or from a pedagogy perspective. Or it might be the kind of thing where they're like, you can't use that because we don't have the funding for it, for example. Those are all other considerations, and we as the student data privacy team don't speak to that at all. We don't give advice on how effective different ed tech tools are for a teaching purpose, but we do give guidance on how to make sure that things are on the up and up in terms of privacy, specifically with our state laws. And so here's kind of like I say, very surface level. If an ed tech product does not get student information, and by get, I mean, that could mean that, either you don't provide that information to the product, or you also need to take into consideration if the product itself tries to collect information from students. So if the product doesn't get student information, then it becomes quite simple, and you can generally just consider that to be okay. An example of this would be like, if you go to Britannica.com, if a teacher were to send their students there and say, I want you to do some research on the, First World War or whatever, and a student goes to Britannica.com, as far as I've been able to tell, there's no information collected from students. It doesn't ask them to sign in or create an account or anything like that. Then there's just one other thing you need to consider, and it goes to PPRA that was just discussed. And that's whether or not the website asks students about these kind of personal questions. They call them sometimes protected information or protected topics. And those are some of those examples are listed there. So that's another thing you need to keep in mind, but that's very uncommon. That's if there's no student information given to the vendor, the ed tech tool. But if it is shared, then it's much more complicated than I'm going to make this sound. But basically, let me pause and say it's not more complicated in the sense that there's necessarily a lot you need to do, but what is built into this first statement that I just made here is more complex. So I've said here, very basically, the ed tech company must agree to meet federal and state requirements. that's where the complexity comes in, is what are those requirements? And John has become a real expert on this. David is really useful, as well as is Whitney. I am very not useful on this particular topic of the actual nitty gritty of the state requirements in particular. But they're a great support in that way. So basically the EdTech company needs to agree to it. And how do they agree to it? Well, they can commit to that by signing a data privacy agreement, or DPA, with your district or charter. And we're actually going to talk about that in more depth, two particular tools that you can use to manage those DPAs in the next session with our panelists. Okay, so addressing sticky issues. Much of the complexity of kind of managing or creating a privacy culture in your district or charter is kind of the complexities of human relations. And our scenario will sort of get at that today. So we're going to talk quickly about when we're addressing these sticky issues, the difference between visceral reactions and intellectual reactions. And if you were in the spring training, you might remember we talked about this some. So as is the case for many of you, I imagine, I have some visceral reactions that are kind of built into my my psyche when I hear about different privacy scenarios. That's because I was an educator. And so, like FERPA is almost in the deep depths of my brain and my instincts. The word FERPA kind of prompts a feeling of fear. Like, I don't know if any of you feel the same way. It's like gotta be careful, that kind of thing. So a visceral reaction is like the first reaction you get before you have time to really think about something. And it's just kind of comes from your gut. It's not after you've thought about it for a long time. Some examples of visceral reactions you might feel would be, some common ones are being irritated or, discouraged or horrified or angry is another really common visceral reaction. And again, like I said, when it comes to FERPA, being worried or stressed or concerned are all kind of common concerns as well, or visceral reactions. So an intellectual reaction, in contrast, is when you're guided by basically your reasoning. So this is not your gut reaction. This is after you've thought, okay, like, let me think about this. And one of the most important parts about an intellectual reaction is that it includes empathy. So when you're interacting with these other parties and relationships can get sticky, one of the best ways to address that is to build in empathy into your intellectual reaction by considering, the other person's point of view. And also kind of stepping back and considering the ultimate goal. I think it was Mike that said earlier, you're really kind of asking yourself like questions about how are these decisions going to affect student learning? That's really the ultimate goal in our schools. Okay, so that's your background on EdTech products, and then sort of that distinction between visceral reactions, your gut reaction, and intellectual reactions, which is where you've actually kind of thought about it and considered different perspectives and that kind of thing. So now we're going to push you out into breakout rooms in just a minute here for you to discuss a specific scenario. Okay, now this is where I want to mention, if you're in a situation where you can't participate, you don't have a mic or something like that, then this is what I want you to do. You're still going to join the breakout room and you can just listen in, or if you can't even listen in, just, exist in there, just kind of be a warm body in the room. But what you need to do is you need to inform your group, give them a heads up that you won't be speaking. So you could do that in the chat, or you could quickly unmute yourself and tell them. So you need to give your group information about your status, basically. Now, that being said, let's say that you end up in a group, you're ready to participate, but you end up in a group of folks who can't. So there's, even this could even be the case if there's only 2 of you and you'd rather be in a bigger group. This probably won't happen, but if it does, then all you need to do is leave the breakout room. You click this leave room button at the bottom of your window that you'll see once we open up the breakout rooms. And then once you're back in the main session, you can just ask John, who he'll be ready for you. And you can say, John, I didn't have anyone to talk with, and he will move you to a different room. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If you are not able to participate, you'll go in there anyway, give your group a heads up. If you are able to participate, but no one else in your assigned group is, then you're gonna leave the breakout room, come back to the main session and ask John to move you. And then I'll be jumping into some of the breakout rooms to just kind of check on people and make sure everyone's doing okay. So you might see me in your room as well. While you're working, you're gonna have your Zoom window open, but you're also gonna need to open up this scenario document. And John's gonna paste a link to this in the chat for you. I'm gonna pull up the document so you can kind of see it. Again, if you were part of the spring training, this might look familiar to you. It's the same format. This document is set so that anyone with the link can edit. So every single person on this call has the ability to type in here. That just, obviously you'll want to be careful to not mess up other people's work. So once I'm in my breakout room, I'm going to identify what room I'm in, and that can be found at the top of your window. It'll say room 1, 2, 3, or 4, whatever. Then in the scenario document, I'm going to go to that group. So let's say I'm in room 11. I'm going to click on group 11 here. And this is my section of the document. So this is where my group 11, can type. We'll read the scenario here, and we'll answer the questions by typing in here. You'll have 15 minutes in your breakout room, and then we'll bring you back to the main session and we'll kind of share out. So do I have any questions from anyone before we send you to your breakout rooms? Oh, let me tell you really quickly what to do when you get in there. Take a second to introduce yourself, tell people what your name is, where you work, and what you do, and that kind of thing. Open up that scenario document. Again, John will paste it in the chat, and go to your page. You're going to read the scenario together as a group and then discuss and answer the questions at the bottom. In the event that your group finishes early, which probably won't happen. I know 15 minutes sounds like a long time, but you probably won't have enough time to get through all the questions anyway. But if you happen to finish early, you can click that leave room button and come back and then just say, John, we're done. And he'll say, okay, wait patiently for everyone else. We'll also give you a couple messages. So you'll see little messages every now and then pop up on your Zoom screen to give you like warnings, 2 minutes left or whatever. Okay, now we're ready. If you have any questions, now's your chance. Otherwise, John's going to open up the rooms and push you out. Okay, John, I think we're ready. That's awesome. Thanks, Clint. Can I ask what you're doing for training and when? I mean, I know that's an issue that all LEAs face is there's so many things that we want to train on, and when do you do it and what modality?
Well, one thing people have to do is during our Safe Schools training at the beginning of each year, all new and all existing employees must take a mini class on FERPA and what the exceptions are and how they work. And then I communicate, from that. So it's in our Safe Schools training that people have to do by September 1st. That's been the best way that we've been able to get the word out to everybody.
Interesting. So it's actually built into a module. Is that information?
Yeah, we have a Safe Schools module that has all their FERPA training. It has, the OSHA training. It has the sexual harassment training, all those trainings. So FERPA is just one of those important classes that we make them take at the beginning of each year.
Awesome. Very cool.
Katie?
Yeah.
This is Lynn Sorensen. In group 6, we talked about this one quite a bit. And I think how you communicate to teachers what the problem is or what's going on is huge. Clint's done an awesome job, and that's cool. I wish I could do that. but you just how you communicate the needs and the issues to the teachers is huge, especially when it comes to cracking down on things like that. So
do you have any specifics there, Lynn? I really appreciate that. Like, tell me what you mean by how you communicate. Are you talking like what you say, the manner in which you say it?
that's mainly what I'm talking about. But also, if there is an issue, are you sending an email, or are you just going and talking with that teacher face to face and explaining what the issue is? That's my biggest thing, is just making sure that you're not using your own visceral reaction, but being intellectual with them. And I think teachers appreciate that. Most people.
Oh, I'm sure they do. I'm really sure they do. I was talking with someone from Canyons the other day, and he was kind of explaining to me how some of those more tense conversations, he would, over time, talking to the exact same teacher, that teacher had come to kind of, to trust him, and it wasn't such a difficult conversation to have after that. It's great. I'm very, very, we've already kind of addressed this one, number 3, but I'm really curious to hear what people's thoughts are. Is there anyone who'd like to share out on number 3?
Katie, this is Robin. I think that it is definitely a matter of training, so that teachers know the language that the language that is included in the data privacy and what it means and where all the forms are and all of that.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else want to share on this one? What do you tell people, like when you have to say no? How do you explain it?
I like to give them a reason.
Yeah.
Why it's a no.
And any examples of what you would tell them?
Well, I was discussing with the people inside my group that we're kind of revamping some of our things and bringing in more people into this group, so that so it's not just 1 or 2 people that are making this decision. It's a broader, a bigger tent, and we need to include all of those people in it, because oftentimes we were discussing earlier this week how many of these products that are being used out in our schools have we already vetted a product for that same purpose that they should be using, but they're not aware of it. Those kind of things.
I love that. David, I don't know if you're available, but I wondered if you would want to talk about the difference between saying no versus yes, but David, I don't know if you're.
Yeah, I think we're kind of hitting on that idea. That's one thing we'll say in meetings often, though, is ultimately, I would say that privacy and security, they're not our end goals. They're a means, or not even necessarily a means. The end goal is education. We need to be providing solutions that meet the teacher's goals to provide quality education for students, but do it in a way that protects the student's information. And so that's why I think sometimes, if we get hung up on a tool and not like purpose, where it's, look, I need this tool because I need to do high quality math instruction for students. It's like, okay, well, maybe we could provide you with an alternative app that's been vetted and works. Or yes, we can do that, but we're going to have to put some extra precautions in place because we have some concerns. Maybe have to do some things using parental consent at like the absolute most extreme as a way to do it. The key is that you want to come up with a solution that helps them achieve the goal of education. If the end goal really was completely keeping the data protected, then we would simply say, well, don't create any data, don't use anything on a computer, don't ever learn your students' names, completely anonymize them. And we don't do that because they're detrimental to us educating children. So it's finding that balance, but I think the simple way to have that balance is just that mantra of, instead of a no, figure out how to get to a yes, but, or a yes with caveats.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, this has been great. Thanks, you guys. The next session is perfectly tied into this. So, and I think you're going to love it. It's a panel discussion. So John, I think, do you want to just take over, or
Yeah,
did I catch you off guard?
No, I'm ready to go.
Okay.
We've got some amazing representatives of different LEAs of different scales, some districts, charters, and we are anxious to, and hopefully if you guys can give me a thumbs up in the chat, you're seeing a slide that says panel discussions between Learn Platform and SDPC. Some of you may know me from our work with SDPC. But what we would like to do is just kind of cover Student Data Privacy Consortium. It manages your data privacy agreements and your contracts with EdTech vendors. It allows you to piggyback off of other LEA contracts. And then we're also going to be discussing Learn Platform, which connects to usage data, has customizable tags, and TeacherView allows for making software requests. So I would like to introduce our 4 panelists. We have Tony Campbell from Washington County School District, Troy Lunt from Iron County School District, Robin, who we've heard from a little bit today from Cache County School District, and Darcy from the Terra Academy. These are our 4 panelists for today. And we are going to be talking about 3 different kind of conceptual pieces to this process in which Katie was talking about just now. So what I'd like to start with from our panelists, what are the goals that you are trying to achieve, and how do SDPC and or Learn help you achieve them? I think let's start with, we'll go with Tony and Troy. We'll kind of go in the order that we're standing here, that our avatars are. So if you guys want to jump in, please go for it.
Okay, since we're going in order, I guess I'm first. So our goals that we're trying to achieve really are about a broader approach than simply compliance. What we wanted to do, and we use Learn Platform primarily, we do use the SDPC to look for the agreements that are already set there within the state so that we can bring those in, but that's more internally in our office. Learn is used broader throughout our whole LEA by all our educators, principals, etc. And our goal was to make Learn a place that folks wanted to go to get a lot of information, not just to see if they could use a tool or not. So we put in information about who supports the tool, how we use the tool. We've put in badges for when the tool is down so that people know that there may be a problem with the tool. We put in links to help pages and to resources and training materials. And so we're just trying to get that broader scope so that it doesn't feel like it's this controlling thing, but it feels like it's a helpful thing.
Troy, what have you got to share with us?
I appreciate that avatar there, John. My mouth would open, but nothing would come out. So hopefully it's.
I was going to give you bigger muscles, but it looked kind of weird.
Well, we actually use both Learn and SDPC. Learn was the first that was put into place, and somewhere along the way, we began to branch out a little bit and develop our requirements, our processes, and ultimately trying to make things as transparent as possible, not only internally within the district, but also because of requirements to let everybody, the community and parents and others know the different apps that we're using. And so I had created a very unattractive spreadsheet that I had on the website. And at the same time, we were using SDPC for the purpose of getting all of our DPAs in line and making sure that we had agreements backing everything. And the introduction of SDPC was quite impressive. The ability to be able to either one, set up a DPA, which is now the NDPA, or being able to use an exhibit that comes from that to support our ability to, as the word is used, piggyback on another DPA that exists. And I was talking with John one day and said, you know, I'd really like to take what's here and make it available on our website so that I don't have this spreadsheet. He said, why don't you plug this URL into a browser and see what happens? And it brought up something that John's going to show you in a little bit, but it was, I think my chair tipped over backwards. I stood up and gave several applause attempts, and just made it so that it achieved many things that we were trying to do, not only the tracking that Tony refers to, but also the ability to be transparent, to give our users, our administrators, and the public that are interested a view into the transparency that we're providing for them.
That's great, Troy. Robin, how about you?
We started out using the Student Data Privacy Consortium solely, and right now, and then I pulled in. I saw some things on Learn that I really liked, and so I'm trying to merge the two together. And like I spoke a little bit earlier about the same thing, where I'm expanding the team that works on this, and so it's not just me and one other person making decisions. It'll be a broad group of people. So I believe that Learn platform provides the tools to include all of those people in and get a structure that you can send it from one person to the next to get all of your approvals. But the Student Data Privacy website is where I go to get all of those DPAs, and that's the one that I have linked in my website right now to list out all of those used products. So that's where we're at.
Thank you, Robin. Darcy, you guys are a small charter in Vernal. What are your goals? What are you guys looking for? How are these tools helping you achieve them?
Hello, everyone. We are a very small charter here in Vernal, Utah, the Terra Academy. We, because we are small and because we are new, we are trying to figure out what the heck we're supposed to be doing and then do it. So transparency is a big deal. Meeting requirements is a big deal. Those are our goals. Now we are to the goal of educating our teachers and having a process so that we can make sure that the resources that they are using are what they should be using in the classroom and safe for the kids. So our goals are, we're still working on some of our goals because we're so new.
Well, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we put this panel together, is because we wanted to have LEAs representative of different scale and size that are using these tools in different ways. And hopefully those of you that are in the audience can kind of find an LEA of like size and scale and maybe try to pick their brain and see where we're going. I know that we had like a preface conversation about this with the panelists a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to, tap Robin and Troy and have them kind of talk about some of our next steps. You had just mentioned this, Darcy, but that idea of process and infrastructure. Robin, where does privacy fit? Is it early in the process or is it later on in your process?
That's a hard thing to decide. Right now, it's been early in the process, but as I'm working with this new team, we're thinking it needs to be a little bit later in the process, because I'm thinking that it needs to go through first the director and the content specialist to make sure that we don't already have something in place that provides that'll get that teacher the same goals. So yeah, I think I'm going to move it back a little bit. Okay. And have content maybe look at it first.
Troy, what do you think? You guys,
Well-
you'd mentioned before that you're in the process of rethinking this whole kind of structure.
Right. Just to give a little bit of background as well, this may come up in some of your discussion as we continue, is there has to be a starting point in this. And I just heard Clint talk about the 1,800 apps that he has approved. It makes all of us look horrible, like we're way behind in the scene. But now that he explained it, I know why he has that many, and that's great. We're running a distant second or third way down the list, but it's nowhere near that. But one of the big challenges in this whole process is, first, you've got to get an inventory together of what you have. And we were fortunate to have some developers with a little bit of time to be able to help us put together a Google form that made it possible to start with what we knew and to circulate that, and they could select if it was on the list, or they could add to it, and then that one would be part of the list for others to select from. And we were able to get to about 90% of the apps that we had. But once we had a good, clear picture of the apps that we were using, we knew we had to develop a process to get those approved going forward. Unfortunately, ours is a little bit more manual in the sense that there is an approval process that must happen between the teacher and the principal, because the principals need to be part of this loop in understanding what apps are being used at the school. And then the request will be pushed up to us to be able to do the vetting of that. The changes that we're beginning to implement a little bit more is, rather than having the vetting of the app be towards the end of the process, we're moving that to the beginning of the process, so that there's not a lot of time and effort put into the curriculum and education side, only to find that from a technological standpoint or a data privacy standpoint, it doesn't meet the requirements, and therefore we can't approve it, or we have to approve it in a way that we would rather not do that. And so we're moving to incorporate some of these built-in capabilities in SDPC and also in Learn. We've continued to use Learn because the teachers are familiar with that, and use those so that we can build this process. So we do have the process, but it's all manual right now at this point, but we will eventually use the tools that are available.
So I'm going to jump over to Darcy real quick, and then we'll go to Troy, just because we're going from Darcy, who's maybe like a little small on the scale, and Troy and Tony, who are a little bit bigger on the scale. But Darcy, you're a charter, small charter. I'm sure that there are quite a few of the participants here that are in the same shoes that you are, as being a small charter and wearing multiple hats. What is your process and infrastructure? What is funding and resource challenges? Do you have this content specialist in place that some of these other folks may or may not have?
You're looking at her. We don't have the same resources. We really, really appreciate the SDPC. I came into this as a media specialist. The administrator was pretty overwhelmed with duties and asked if I would help out. So I'm trying to figure it out as I go. And I absolutely love when we can get together and visit, because then I can see what other people are doing and then try to figure out how that works on our scale as a charter. So it's really, really helpful. I wanted to share that initially there was a Google Doc that the administrator, and I appreciate their efforts for sure, but it was awful. It was hard. It was hard because there was all these, I felt like there was a lot of things in lots of different places, and I wanted to have one place. So that's where the SDPC came in for me. And the link that I think Tony just talked about has been really, really helpful for us as a charter, because we put that on our site and the teachers now go to that and they put in whatever information they want, and then I review it, and then it goes to admin from there. But I think we're still trying to figure out that process. And I don't know if I just answered your question, but that was what was on my head. So
No. That I mean, you talking about moving through that, and I think that's a great segue into what Tony wants to share is some of that process, because I know that Washington is just, you guys are way ahead of the game on some of this.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. We've been working hard at this for quite a long time, and we've revised things and figured things out. We went through a smaller scale to try and get to where we're at the moment. So I'll share the screen for just a second. Okay. Really, the first thing that we needed to figure out as a larger LEA was a workflow. And the first time we did this, I should have saved it, but there were probably 2 or 3 times as many little boxes on this. And we were like, no, this can't be this hard. And so we kept going back and back and back and trying to just simplify this and simplify this. And we'd go to our content coordinators and, be like, okay, is this going to work? Is this okay? What do we need to do here? And really, we got to the point where we're looking at whether it's what we're calling our core products. And a core product is something that we're using in either an entire grade level, an entire subject level area, or as an entire district. And so for those core products, we really have a more formal review process. And that's this little section up here on the left. And if it's not, we want to check with our ESL and our special education departments just to look at any legal kinds of compliance issues that we may have there within a product. And we also want to look and see, is there a product in Learn platform already that meets that need? And if there is, then we don't want to have those duplicate products that are doing the same thing. And if not, our content coordinators take a look at this, and we look at whether or not the product has a cost. And if it has that cost, then we push that through the business department over here. And if there's not a potential cost, then we go ahead and we walk through these portions and make determinations. And like Troy mentioned and other people have mentioned, let me see if I can get that to escape out. There we go. We really had to try and figure out what comes first in the process, because we have a limited amount of people. And I think all of us are in that case, regardless of our size. If you're smaller LEA, you probably have fewer requests. And if you're a larger LEA, you're going to have more requests because you have more educators. And so what we determined to do is use the workflows within Learn platform, and our teachers place a request using a submission form. And that form is customized. It asks the questions that we need to know answers to in order to determine whether or not we can approve a product, such as, is there a cost? Is there advertising on the product? What content area is it for? Those are just a few samples of the types of questions. And then as a tech department, we receive that and we look at that against the data privacy law. We get to be the experts, if you will, of that. And once we've looked at that and done that initial vet, we're like, okay, there's nothing glaring and blaring and frightening about this. We go ahead and we push that out to the content coordinator, who reviews it for pedagogy, for duplication, as far as do we have other things that do that, etc. And they give us a review, basically a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or the things that you do in Learn platform on that. And we've walked through that, and right here, these are the steps that our content coordinators walk through. If it needs to go to the business department, it goes to them. If there's a cost and we're doing a purchase and we need an RFP or a bid or whatever in that way. And then it comes back to the digital learning team and we mark the status of the product. And we realized very quickly that educators are going to say, hey, I want to use this, get it approved. I want to use this, get it approved. And so our stance at this point is that we mark the product conditional, parent consent required. And if the teacher wants to contact the vendor, we have an actual signature form in our legal document and stuff. They can send the preview link and the link for the document to be executed through that automated workflow. Then the teacher can reach out to that vendor and try and get that. If they get that DPA signed, then we'll go ahead and we can update the status of the product to approved for all students. And if not, we leave it as conditional, parent consent required. But in Learn Platform, we have the information for the parent guardian consent forms linked right inside of Learn Platform. We also have the instructions for how they can go to the vendor and request that DPA. And what we're finding is, that when teachers see that there's that work, it does a few things. It lets them know that we're not trying to slow things down. It takes time, trying to find the right person, trying to get the documents signed. All of that is really a laborious kind of an effort. And teachers will sometimes go, you know what, there's another product that's similar that's already approved. I'm just going to use it. And so it narrows the scope of what we've got. Whereas if we're doing all the work, it's like request, request, request. And that's not a bad thing. And we're not trying to impose anything on the teachers. We want them to be a part of the process. We want them to understand that process in meaningful ways, so that they can be more judicious in the decisions they make as far as what they work with, what they use, what they don't. And then if there is, because you talked about principles to wrap this up, if there's a product that's denied, we didn't want like 2,000 requests coming back to us to approve it again, right? And so we gatekeep that through the principal. And denied products have a form. The first question on it in Learn Platform is, are you the principal? If no, then it says, go talk to your principal. And the principal can place that request for a denied product for us to review. And we may just come back to the principal and say, we've met with these folks 3 times and they're just not compliant. These are the reasons why. And we have those marked in internal notes on the product. They're just visible to the system admins. So, and the last thing with that, see if I can get over to this tab. We did icons, which we can do inside Learn Platform. They show up at the top of a product to help folks understand who's supporting the product, if there's a technical glitch with the product. So this product is not working right now. They're having a problem with it, or hey, we need a bid on this product, or hey, this product is for esports only. Parent guardian discretion is advised, just to make sure that you're comfortable with that, etc. And Cody Plumhoff designed the icons for us, but it just helps us know. And then we also just added one that shares data with provider to make it really clear as to whether or not we're sharing data with the product. So.
Tony, don't do anything well that you don't want to do again. You guys are doing fantastic, and I think that provides a segue into our next section. And I know that a lot of folks are asking in the chat if they can have access to some of your resources, and so if that's something that you're okay with for all of you, that would be something that we'd like to pass along. But if we're seeing the correct screen, we're looking at something where we're talking about people and who else is involved. And Darcy, I want to start with you, because something that came up in our previous discussion is, as the person that wears one of many hats, administrative support, and how you've seen kind of that change, and something that's come up that in our conversation before that hasn't necessarily come up in our conversation right now is this idea of culture change, and how some of you are in the midst of a culture change, and how some of you have achieved a culture change, but which people are involved, what kind of pushback. We talked about this with this is kind of segueing back to Katie's scenarios, these relationships and who all is involved in this. And do you have a curriculum specialist? And I'm going to stop talking. Darcy, you're up.
Okay, so your question to me is
just
who's involved in
administration.
our process?
How have you seen those culture changes? You've seen that over the course of the last, 18 months or so?
Yeah, probably. I have learned, so I was super excited to take on this responsibility just because it gave me an opportunity to learn and grow, and be an asset for my LEA. But the more that I learn, the more that I understand that administration really does need to be involved. They're the ones who, because we don't have, I'm super envious of Tony and Troy. This is just remarkable. The resources, so great. But administratively, they have more knowledge and experience when it comes to the contracts and what they really do and don't want to approve in the classrooms. So us as a charter school, where we are sitting right now, I need to have their input. I need to have such a great communication, really great communication with them and understanding, so that in due time I can take that responsibility a little bit more and maybe sign off on some of those contracts. But we are, as far as that relationship goes, and the importance of who needs to be involved in the process, several people need to be engaged and involved in it, and to have an understanding and not push it by the wayside, because it is really important. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I hope it is.
No, I think that's great. Robin,
but yeah,
you mentioned that you're shaking up your team. How does that
work? Well, I didn't really have a team in the past, but now I have a team. So we've got, there's a technician on it, and the guy that's over the technicians in IT, some directors, one for elementary, one for secondary. And I, you guys had mentioned a little bit about have you talked to your principal about this? That is the first question on our request. Have you talked to your principal? If you haven't talked to him, go talk to him now. Don't submit this without talking to your principal, kind of thing. But so them, and then the content, our coaches and our content area specialists are part of it. It's still we're still kind of fleshing it all out, but I'm hoping that we'll have a good workflow going on, and that it won't just all come to me and stop there.
I mean, I think that's the hope, is that we're not the only ones wearing this hat. And I, enjoyed Tony's perspective of having the teachers being involved in that process so that they understand. When we talk about having this display being available to everybody, and Troy, you'd mentioned that you'd put that URL on your website. I don't know if you can talk about, the people involved maybe being your audience and who sees this display. And I think, Troy, you had mentioned something about other districts asking questions.
Yeah, sure. Just two different perspectives on this. From the inside, we have spent a lot of time working with our administrators and with our teachers and other staff members, that if they're interested in trying to find an app for a particular purpose, it's just automatic. They go check the website. It's 2 clicks, and you can bring up the SDPC approved list. And it provides a lot of very important information, not only links to being able to go out and look at the app, but being able to look at the agreements themselves to see if there are certain inclusions or exclusions, what data is shared. There's just a lot of information that's very easily and very quickly available. But also, as we work within our region down in the area that we're in Southwest Utah, and there are other areas that can also take advantage of this, where you've got groups of maybe larger districts combined with more of rural districts. I have a hard time saying that word, rural, so I hope that came out good. But from time to time, I'll have an opportunity to work with some of the smaller districts that are in the state, that I can show them examples of what we've done and make that available. I think there's one aspect to this that we really haven't touched on that I will introduce now, just get it out there in the open. Probably no comments need to go with it, but I think it's important to share, and that is, we're talking about the apps that are currently being used. But we also, in our district, we put in a lot of time to be prepared for, well, what happens if? So for example, if we were to go back into a lockdown and we have certain apps that have a lot of technology resource intensive requirements. Some of these might be Adobe tools or CAD tools or things like that. And so our students at home, if they take a Chromebook home, they don't satisfy what's required by some of these different programs and apps. And so we also spend a fair amount of time finding those alternatives that we do approve, so that if it's, in addition to it being approved, it's also approved in scenarios where the students might be at home. If you've got a student that's home and can't make it in because that student is ill for a period of time, then they can use these alternative programs, alternatives to some of the Adobe and some of the CAD programs that our teachers know that are both going to be approved. And so, working to develop those kinds of things as well. Not actually directly related to the what your question was, but it does just open us up a little bit more to others that might be interested in that information.
No, I mean, I think that it kind of dovetails on some of the stuff that PTAC was talking about, is just having that team of people that is forward thinking in what do we do if we go back home? What do we do if we have a data breach response that's needed? What do we do if, having those people? And then as we kind of wrap up here, because we're running up against the clock, as we started 15 minutes late today, and I'm proud of us for getting to where we're at. Tony, there's been some questions, and it seems like you're our go-to Learn platform expert, but who do you, for those of you that don't know, if you have any questions about SDPC, I am the representative here in Utah. I am the Alliance lead. I have been deputized as such, but who do you talk to, Tony, for those that are interested in learning more about Learn? Is that somebody? Do you have resources here at USBE? Some folks at Learn Platform that you can recommend for some of these other LEAs that may have access to Learn but have yet to put the keys in the Ferrari?
We have our rep at Learn Platform. Each LEA has a rep assigned. If you just go to if you know how to get to Learn, you can send a little email form in. They'll get you connected with your rep and get you taken care of there. And then as far as for us with our process, they've been great to work with us anytime we want to do like the impact reports to start looking at data or workflows or whatever else. We've been able to easily jump in there and work with those folks. And then this year, as far as our process, we went through and built out a slide deck, send it to each school so that the principal and learning coach could walk through that with their teachers, talking about the library and introducing its purpose and how we use it and all of that. So
that's fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Hopefully you appreciated the animated versions of you that I tried to create. Troy, like I said, more muscles next time. But what I am going to do here as we wrap up some of this panel conversation and turn to wrapping up our training for today, I'm going to drop in the chat our closing document, and that is a document that we normally include at the end of our trainings for the sake of providing you with any sort of links that you may or may not have or want access to. And then we also have a link to our survey, which we would invite all of you to take a look at and help with to fill that out. I'm going to see that it looks like, there's about 15 people checking out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this closing document while we wrap up. And if there are any questions, please include them in the chat. But as you can see here, this is all of our contact information. Whitney, David, Katie, and me, John. This is our survey link if you'd like to click on it. This is the YouTube link that Ross put into, that he was talking about for PPRA. Here are some of Katie's things if you'd like to go back and look at it. I dropped Troy's, Tony, sorry, it's a little mental dyslexia. You guys are like one letter off from each other into here, but I know that we can get a more, something with a little bit more fidelity to it if you'd like to take a look at it. Here's some action items that we would request of you if you haven't done it already, or if you are new to this process, subscribing to our newsletter. This is the post survey. If you haven't yet, all of our YouTube videos have been moved to a new channel. They were last spring. So if you'd like access to that, and we should have updated our website as well, so that's on the front page of our website. And then Katie put together within the last couple of months this video on military recruiters and institutions of higher education. It's fantastic. If you need some resources from our team, we have this one. We also have our Security for Teachers that talks about ransomware and different practices following the CIS Controls 17. We'll update that for CIS 18. And then for all of you who are records managers or deal with records, we have our records retention schedule and our records training. Our goal is to get all of the LEA records officers in the state certified, and we are very close to that goal. So if you have yet to certify or you need anybody at your LEA to take a look at that, please do so. But with that, I don't know, let's check in with the team and see if we've got anything outstanding that we'd like to discuss.
Maybe just put one note in there that we're happy the Astros went down last night.
Very happy. The right choice.
Oh, I knew that baseball was going to come into this. That's
I guess,
fantastic.
John, just a reminder of that survey. I don't know if they saw the link. It was to the survey, but we really want your feedback.
Mm-hmm. And I'll put that in again.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to also say is when we planned this event, one of the questions we get in the survey, well, we looked at the survey we did last spring and really used it a lot to determine what was the content for this event. So we're trying our best to understand your needs and wants when putting together programs like this. And so if you liked it, please go in the survey and reflect that, and also indicate other topics that are of interest or need. And if you didn't like it, then you can also go and indicate that, and we'll try to put together something better next time. But yeah, just wanted to reiterate, please, only takes a couple of minutes, probably easiest to do right now, and then you can go grab some lunch.
Doesn't look like we have, thanks, Craig. I remember when we were at our training together. I'm glad that you like that. Save you from going down to archives. You guys can always hit us up at privacy@schools.utah.gov. We always look forward to hearing from you, and let us know if we can ever visit you in your LEA in the future. With that, I think that we will bid you adieu and wish you a fantastic afternoon.